Thank you so much, and good afternoon from Bulgaria. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, I'm Sana, and I'm a program officer with the UNF CCC Secretariat. I have been working on registry systems and on information systems in the context of the CDM for over a decade, and more recently my responsibilities have shifted towards intergovernmental process support. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I now have cherry blossoms on my mind, but of course, and I hope I'll maintain this mood. And of course, sincere thanks to the organizers for creating this opportunity. So my role is to set the background for the discussions today, and I would like to do so by covering briefly some remarks around the context and highlight some of the key provisions in the decision text on authorization. I will make some remarks around the evolution of the discussions, and I will wrap it up with the work program agreed by the CMA for this year. I think we can skip a slide and go, please, directly to the next one. Yes, thank you. So just to set the scene, let me start by stating the obvious, that the authorization is the gateway to the Article 6 markets, and it represents a decision by a party to participate in a cooperative approach. It also signals the birth of an ITMO, including in scenarios where mitigation outcome may have already been achieved and even transferred. And it's also a ticket for entities to engage with the system. Authorization is central because it delivers clarity, stability, and predictability for the system, and it carries obligations for corresponding adjustments by the host party, and in this way it underpins the accounting integrity of the system. The first ITMO authorization towards users sets the deadline for initial report submission. So in this context, will be interesting to explore probably how this applies in the context of some of the early pilots in the Article 6.2 space. And finally, authorization has a time frame. Authorization for cooperative approach entities and ITMOs may be subject to changes. And therefore, it has a life cycle with possible changes which could have varied and wide implications for the system, for the operationalization of the guidance and the RMPs for Article 6.4, but also on domestic processes and the international market overall. I would point out that with regard to operationalizing the guidance, all areas are impacted by authorization. In the area of accounting, the question is how first transfer is applied for multi-use ITMO authorizations. There is an impact on the preparation of reports, initial, annual, and regular information. Authorization impacts on the digital infrastructure. There is an important impact on the registries in particular, and specifically how information on authorizations is recorded, updated, and propagated across the registries. Next slide, please. So I have just alluded to the three types of authorization that are reflected in the Article 6.2 guidance. And I'm just showing the reference to the paragraphs introducing each authorization type. But I would highlight specifically that the participation requirements in Article 6.2, among many other provisions that reflect on authorization, include the requirements for parties to have arrangements in place for authorizing ITMOs for uses. Authorization for ITMOs may be made explicit in this context because in the earlier stages of the negotiation on Article 6, I'm talking here about the years running up to COP26, it was this type of authorization that was central to the guidance, authorization of ITMO for uses. And then, of course, the authorization of entities and authorization of a cooperative approach was also mentioned, and they also have their importance. As we will see, they're all reflected in the work program for this year. Finally, let me just mention that Article 6.2, the rules, modalities, and procedures, contain a distinct approval and authorization process. for authorized Article 6 for emission reductions and for activity participants. And this process is broadly aligned with Article 6 too. This alignment is, of course, necessary to ensure the coherence of the system where Article 6 for activities with ICMOS are reported according to the requirements of the guidance. Next slide, please. So moving on, discussions at both informal and formal fora have broadly identified that authorization process could be viewed in two phases, arriving at the decision to authorize and then managing authorization afterwards. Issuing authorization has a rather domestic focus, and it considers issues particularly relevant to the NDC, long-term emission development strategies and so on. And the second phase has more focus on, it considers all of the above, but has a focus on the international arrangements and any ongoing trading arrangements. So in the discussions of unpacking the authorization process steps, many questions have been raised. I think we can move to the next slide. And just to give you a flavor and recall some of those questions, I'm giving a non-exhaustive list of examples here, and I have just made an effort to group some of those questions around themes. So, questions with regard to who can issue an authorization. Is it the first transferring party that authorizes uses of ICMOS, which is explicit in Article 6.4, or a using party can possibly limit the scope of the authorization? Questions around timing were also discussed. For example, at what point in the ICMO life cycle the use towards NDC could be authorized. Many questions were asked around authorization scope and information elements that have been included in authorization, that have to be included in authorization. For example, does authorization apply to all ICMOS from a cooperative approach equally? Can a party issue multiple authorizations? And if yes, how ICMOS are identified? What entities can do and what they're empowered to do? And also, does Article 6 for activity approval could serve as authorization of a cooperative approach? There were questions also around methods of authorization, what are the possible changes, and also questions around how information details will be included in reporting, in the reporting requirements. So just to wrap it up, we can move to the next slide, please. In working around those many questions, the CMA have structured the work program on authorization for this year. Last year did not deliver significant outcome in this area. Many felt that this key process should not be rushed, considering its wide implications and the need to understand and manage host parties' risks for NDC targets, and the need to get this right overall. Parties set out to deliver on authorization this year, both in relation to the guidance and the rules, modalities, and procedures for the mechanism. Therefore, the work program covers authorization types with focus on scope, timing, and revisions, possible revisions. Outcomes on other elements in the negotiation process would also shed light on how authorization is handled. I would like to highlight here, in particular, the work on finalizing the agreed electronic format for annual information under Article 6.2. This reporting format may be one opportunity to clarify how authorization is reported. For example, what information has to be communicated in the IEF, and how information from authorization and how changes to authorizations are managed within the IEF. It would also clarify if actions on mitigation outcomes prior to the authorization have to be reported, and more aspects, of course. So just in closing, the work program is meant to deliver on this key guidance on authorization, which parties can agree on, but certainly many relevant aspects may be left to the implementation. And in this context, the active engagement and the capacity building going forward will be very important. So I would like to stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.